Which of the following best describes a public endpoint in Azure? A public endpoint is an IP address that is accessible from the internet. B. A public endpoint is an IP address that is only accessible within a virtual network. C. A public endpoint is a private IP address used for internal communication. D. A public endpoint is an IP address that is only accessible through a VPN. The correct answer is A. A public endpoint is an IP address that is accessible from the internet. A public endpoint is an IP address that is accessible from the internet, allowing external users to connect to Azure resources. The other options describe private endpoints or restricted access scenarios. What is a primary benefit of using private endpoints in Azure? A private endpoints reduce the cost of data transfer. B. Private endpoints provide secure access to Azure services over a private IP address. C. Private endpoints increase the speed of data transfer. D. Private endpoints allow access to Azure services from any location on the internet. The correct answer is B. Private endpoints provide secure access to Azure services over a private IP address. Private endpoints provide secure access to Azure services over a private IP address, ensuring that traffic remains within the Azure network. The other options do not accurately describe the primary benefit of private endpoints. You need to ensure that your Azure SQL database is only accessible from within your virtual network. Which solution should you implement? Configure a public endpoint for the Azure SQL database. B. Use a private endpoint for the Azure SQL database. C. Set up a VPN to the Azure SQL database. D. Enable a firewall rule for the Azure SQL database. The correct answer is B. Use a private endpoint for the Azure SQL database. Using a private endpoint for the Azure SQL database ensures that it is only accessible from within your virtual network. Configuring a public endpoint or setting up a VPN does not restrict access to the virtual network alone. Enabling a firewall rule can restrict access but does not provide the same level of security as a private endpoint. Which Azure service can be accessed using both public and private endpoints? A. Azure Blob Storage. B. Azure Virtual Network. C. Azure Active Directory. D. Azure DevOps. The correct answer is A. Azure Blob Storage. Azure Blob Storage can be accessed using both public and private endpoints, allowing for flexible access configurations. Azure Virtual Network, Azure Active Directory, and Azure DevOps do not support both types of endpoints in the same manner. A company wants to ensure that their web application hosted in Azure App Service is not accessible from the public internet. What should they configure? Set up a public endpoint with IP restrictions. B. Use a private endpoint for the Azure App Service. C. Enable DDoS protection for the Azure App Service. D. Configure a VPN gateway for the Azure App Service. The correct answer is B. Use a private endpoint for the Azure App Service. Using a private endpoint for the Azure App Service ensures that the web application is not accessible from the public internet. Setting up a public endpoint with IP restrictions or enabling DDoS protection does not fully restrict public access. Configuring a VPN gateway is not the most straightforward solution for this requirement. Which of the following scenarios would most likely require the use of a public endpoint? A company needs to allow external customers to access their website hosted on Azure. B. A company needs to ensure that their internal applications communicate securely within a virtual network. C. A company needs to restrict access to their Azure resources to only on-premises networks. DA company needs to connect their on-premises network to Azure securely. The correct answer is A. A company needs to allow external customers to access their website hosted on Azure. A public endpoint is required when a company needs to allow external customers to access their website hosted on Azure. The other scenarios involve internal or restricted access, which would be better served by private endpoints or VPNs.